Ready to go?
Yeah.
Great, okay. Hi everybody, thanks for coming. So welcome to the next seminar on the Robot Learning Seminar Series. Today we have Professor Ingmar Posner from the University of Oxford. He leads the Applied Artificial Intelligence Lab in the Oxford Robotics Institute. And he was also co-founder of Oxbotica and has a role with Amazon, so he's also got a lot of industrial experience, so he knows how to get things working in reality, which is always good. A couple of weeks ago we were at the UK Robot Manipulation Workshop and Ingmar and I both gave a talk there, and I think after that we realised actually we share a lot of similar opinions as to what the challenges are, how to get robotics really working in the real world. And I really enjoyed his talk, and I'm also tomorrow I'm actually examining one of his PhD students, so this is an unusual opportunity for me to essentially grill the supervisor before I then grill the student, which is a nice change. So I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Lovely opportunity though, isn't it? It's nice.
For me.
In general, I think it's nice.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks so much for coming. And yeah, I really look forward to your talk. Over to you.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Ed. Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me in the back there? Yeah, that's good. Excellent. Okay. So thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's been a long while since I actually came to Imperial to talk to people technically, which is lovely. I today want to tell you a little bit about some of the things that's close to my heart in terms of learning to perceive and to act. And I've got this rather funky sort of undertitle here, Disentangling Tales from Structured Latent Space, because one of my interests is how some of that stuff relates to the latent representations that we learn in deep learning. Okay, so that's where we're going with this. But before I get there, one of the things that's always been driving me really is, we met at the manipulation workshop. I'm not a manipulation guy. I've always been interested in thinking about how machines perceive and interpret space. That's basically it. So from some of the early days, these are the kind of things that I've been doing in the sense of, for the past sort of 10, 15 years, I've been spending time in mobile autonomy, so getting from A to B. But the kind of questions that I've been asking is things like, how do we detect objects, for example, natively in 3D? So we're the first to do that with a deep convolutional stack. Systems level self-supervision is a super powerful tool, I think. We've done quite a bit of that, where you say, actually, I have one part of the system that learns from another part of the system how to operate, how to perform a particular function. And then when you actually come to deployment, you can pair back the first system and go, okay, now this works by itself. It's a completely different talk. Very happy to talk to you guys about that at some point. Learning from demonstration is clearly a very important part of how we act and interact with robots, right? And so one of the pieces of work that we've done a while back is on large-scale learning from demonstration, large-scale IRL, in a deep learning framework that allowed us to learn to drive like a human drives from, tens of thousands of actual real-world trajectories. So that was pretty cool. But much closer to the subject of today's talk is this, which is really about interpreting what happens in a scene. Okay, ideally in an unsupervised way. And the reason why I want to talk about that is because one of the visions that drives what most of my lab is doing is, imagine you have a robot that is faced with a particular scene, okay, and it's supposed to perform a particular task. I don't know, it's in a supermarket stacking shelves or something like that, okay? And what I would like to be able to do, or what I would like the machine to be able to do, is map what it sees, map its observations into an internal model of what is going on with the world. Think of it as a digital twin, right? A bit like that. A bit like a simulation, but learned. Caveat on that, but fine. A bit like a simulation. Map it into an internal model. In that model, come up with a plan of how to perform the task. In that model, also assess whether the skill set that the machine, that the robot has, is good enough to perform those tasks. And if it turns out, introspection, and if it turns out that it isn't, ultimately we want the system to be able to rehearse in that internal model to stand a better chance to then roll it out into the real world. So, it may not be data efficient as such, but it's real world data efficient in terms of it doesn't require, hundreds of thousands of rollouts to do something like that. So that's sort of the bigger vision. And in order to get there, we're really all about sort of robust, scalable robot learning, particularly through observation, action, and interaction. And the current focus on the lab is very much on unsupervised learning for scene interpretation, planning, and control. And so some of the workhorses for the work that we do is deep generative models for actual world models. I'll say more about that in a second. But we use them for things like scene interpretation, generation, prediction. Intuitive physics is actually quite a big one. I'll not talk about that too much today. Objectness, yes. Affordances, yes. talked about system-level self-supervision, planning and control in structured latent spaces, talking a lot about that today, and system introspection. And if you were kind of to look at my lab, you would probably see about two halves to that story. One is looking at world models, so how can we learn models of the world, how the world evolves, how can we perform scene inference generation.
Could you say that again?
Lovely. Scene interpretation, this is not ChatGPT yet. Scene interpretation, scene inference generation and prediction, how we can do skill acquisition and so on. So this is sort of the simulation side, the world model side, the internal model side. And then on the other hand, once we have that, we actually want to perform efficient skill acquisition from scratch, from demonstration, but it needs to be sample efficient. We need to have introspection, we need to have metacognition, and ideally also be able to plan in those world models. That's sort of how the big picture fits together. And in terms of the skill acquisition, just to give you a flavor of the kind of stuff that we are doing in manipulation, and I said to Ed earlier, for me, manipulation is more like a vehicle to explore some of these concepts, right? So the kind of things that we have done there is goal condition visual motor control. Are you happy with visual motor control? Yeah, excellent, good. And I think the system that we based this on is actually your VMC architecture. Anyway, so goal condition VMC, where you're saying, well, actually, visual motor control typically says put yellow on blue, and then forever you will put yellow on blue, which seems a bit naff, right? Because the putting on seems like a useful skill, and you'd like to generalize it. And so you can condition that with a goal image up here to actually perform a sort of a different task. Interestingly, back in the day, when we did this a few years ago, people said, well, but where do the goal images come from? I think we have a pretty convincing answer to that now, given what's been going on in terms of generative modeling, right? Introspective visual motor control for proactive error recovery. So the idea here is that your policy keeps track of how uncertain it is and tries to predict its own uncertainty in the future after a few steps, and says, well, actually, if I'm too far out of where I'm comfortable, I will just backtrack to a place that is comfortable for me. Okay, and then I might do a random perturbation and then roll out again. And it turns out that adds quite a lot in terms of robustness. And then one thing over here is sort of cross-instance matching. So if you use sort of language vision models, something like CLIP, for example, it turns out what you can do is when you have a goal configuration of, put the stapler over there or something, you may not actually have the instances of the objects that are on the table, right? So you might have an image of a table set, and you have a table that is set or that isn't set, and you have got a different set of cutlery or crockery or whatever. You still want to perform that matching, right? And so this cross-instance matching is also something that is now sort of available to us. Everyone here is going to have heard of a whole bunch of these models, right? Who is excited about deep learning, generative deep learning? Yeah, generative models, yeah? Okay, a bunch of people. Excellent, good. And so here's a good question. First thought, what do you think we could use this stuff for in the context of robotics? A lot of people are now talking about generating goal images. Yeah, good. But there's clearly some other stuff that we can also do with that, which is generate data, synthetic data, right? So particularly when it comes to data that is really difficult to synthesize otherwise, because the physical processes are really tricky. Like in this case, for example, radar data, right? The image formation process for radar is horrible. Why? Because it very, very heavily depends on what the scene context is, right? And so one thing that we've done with a fairly obvious way of doing it with a GAN approach is basically to say, well, actually, what if I take a bulk standard car simulator, in this case Carla, but any simulator will give you sort of a height map. We can then map from that height output directly from the simulator into a credible radar map, and then we can use that for downstream processing, right? And there's a really interesting conversation to be had about how that works and what the limitations are of that. Another place where that is useful is when it comes to synthesizing tactile data, right? So data collection for tactile data is time consuming. If you have and it could also be very resource intensive. If you do it in simulation, you need a really good model of the sensor, like a mesh model of the sensor, a mesh model of the thing that you're touching, and you need to be able to mimic the physical process so you can simulate it. That takes a lot of time. Or if you don't have that, you say, well, I have a sensor, I'm just going to do this, I'm just going to get lots of data like that. It takes you the time to collect the data, okay? And so one way to get around that is to say, for example, okay, well, we can just synthesize that data, but we can do it in a particular way where we say we first learn a nerve model that gives you an RGBD output, and we can do that reasonably efficiently. In fact, there's a whole community of people working on nerves that make it more efficient by the day, which is delightful. Okay, and then we can say once we've got this RGBD output, we can do a bulk standard style transfer into what it looks like to have a generated tactile image. Okay, and the reason why that is useful to split it up like that is because we can separate the learning of the nerve from the learning of the tactile sensor profile, which means we can actually adapt fairly efficiently to different sensors. Okay, and so this just gives you an idea of what this looks like. So these are the sort of objects. This is sort of a real-world object, and if you look at the paper down here, it's unfortunate. Okay, then you'll see that actually, so it handles 3D objects and rotations quite nicely. It also deals with some things that nerves deal really well with that RGBD sensors tend to not, like for example transparent objects. So that is quite good. Novel objects, novel viewpoints. We demonstrated work in the real world. And one thing that often comes up when we talk about this is if you look at this architecture, clearly the nerve isn't going to be perfect, right? It's going to have some artifacts. But the interesting thing about splitting it up like this is that when you then train the style transfer, it to some degree learns to correct, to kind of make up for those artifacts, which is sort of an interesting byproduct of what we see. Okay, but I talked about perception and action, and that I gave a perception and action headline. So where does that come from? And so the question then is, where does perception and action meet generative models, right? And so this is sort of my own personal take on that. You may agree with it, you may not agree with it, or you may want to expand on it. Very happy to have that conversation. But in a way, we've tried a whole bunch of common approaches when it comes to getting to perception and action. Very first, we tried the pipelining approach, right? So we have discrete components where, say, I have a detector and I have a planner, and then I have a controller that executes the trajectories and so on. And each part of that may well go wrong. And of course, one of the big drivers for deep learning was to say, we can do it end to end, we stick it all together, we learn representations that sort of fit together quite nicely and do that for us. So the pipelining approach tended to be brittle. Side note, I think in some of the systems that you see come out recently, you're kind of almost going back to a pipelining thing, right? Where you're saying, here's your neural architecture, here's the bit that does this, here's the bit that does this, here's the bit that does this, right? Which is sort of an interesting conversation to have. Then there's learning from demonstration, right? Absolutely, we kind of briefly touched on it. So we've got behavioral cloning, which I'm sure you'll all be familiar with, which can be super brittle. It's actually surprisingly, it's more robust than you might think, but it can be very brittle. You've got visual motor control, which is behavioral cloning on steroids, basically. You've got inverse reinforcement learning, which is can also be fairly brittle, and depending on what scale you run it at, can be very demonstration intensive. You've got reinforcement learning, which is clearly very, very inefficient when it comes to data use, right? And reinforcement learning clearly has its place, and it's a nice puzzle piece, but it is a puzzle piece. So let's keep that in mind. Then there's model predictive control, which, glibly put, you might say, hey, I have a model of the world. I might sample what happens when I perform particular actions, and then I'm going to choose the action that gets me closest to my goal, right? That's sort of one way of doing it. And of course, there is the visual foresight body of works. I think there's about six or seven papers on that that sort of go about doing that. And then in 2018, Hans Schmidhuber wrote a paper on world models, where basically they talk about predicting the evolution of the world, but purely learned on observation and interaction, right? And in that case, it was a generative model. I don't know. Who is familiar with the world models paper? Cool. Okay. If you're not, seriously, read it. It's a good paper. It's got some really interesting nuggets in it. But the idea there is that from observation and interaction, you learn a model that tells you what happens when you perform a particular action. Right? So you model the world, and you also can then learn an agent within the world. And actually, one of my favorite nuggets from that paper is the model that it learns, the world model that it learns, is not perfect. Okay, it's got its flaws, but it's good enough to do what the agent needs to do. Right? Which actually begs the question: what might trigger the world model to get better? And that's one of the questions that I debate with my students quite a bit. And one of the theories that we have is, well, actually, if you have a world model that doesn't cater for one task, or an agent that has to perform one task, but many tasks, you would expect it to become more complete, right? Do I have a proof of that? No. Do I hope to get one? Yes. We'll see. But so the interesting thing then is that people say, well, okay, these world models are kind of cool. We can do something with that. But we can probably take the representations that are learned for those models and introduce some structure. So we can do that based on control assumptions, like, for example, embed to control here, or based on planning mechanisms, like a whole bunch of papers, like Universal Planning Network and so on, or based on disentanglement, like the deep variational base filter, Planet, Dreamer V1, V2, V3, like all of that stuff. And that is really true and really interesting. And sort of on the disentanglement side, we'll see more about that in a little while. But, you know, arguably, there's still some things missing from that sort of approach. The first one is reasoning over task-relevant entities, e.g. objects, and I'll make a case for that in a second. Then a coherent and consistent generation and prediction of what goes on. You know, think about something that is physically plausible. Two things can't exist in the same place at the same time, right? Like ultimately also the application to real-world data systems. And this is, I feel very passionate about that, and that turns out to be quite tricky still. So I also gave you that subheader about latent spaces, so let's talk about the latent spaces. Don't worry about this slide too much. I just want to make a couple of very obvious points, okay? Before we talked about ChatGPT and the GPT lines and any of that, our standard sort of go-to models for unsupervised learning, for deep generative modeling, were sort of twofold. Right? There are two standard things that we reach for: variational autoencoders and GANs. Okay, strictly speaking, so those are the two flavors here. They're not quite the same, and that's sort of an important takeaway point. This one here, the variational autoencoder, is sort of bidirectional, which means I actually encode something and then I decode it again with a reconstruction loss and something else. I'll talk about that in a second. But that means I can encode the data and evaluate the likelihood of a datum. So I can grab a datum of my pile, shove it through there and go, well, actually, how likely is it under the model, right? And that's going to be a useful thing to think about. It performs amortized inference when we kind of do this. In contrast, the GAN provides samples from the data distribution. It doesn't per se have an inference module. Of course, you can bolt one on and condition it. But essentially, it optimizes this whole thing with an implicit density loss, which is this minimax game, right? Whereas the variational autoencoder actually optimizes a thing called ELBO, the evidence lower bound. Okay. Now, the evidence lower bound is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a lower bound to the data distribution. Okay, which is a really, really useful thing to have. And so for those of you who are sort of not that familiar with this, there are essentially two parts to this. One is the reconstruction error that says this guy needs to look like that. And then there's a regularizer that says, well, actually, your posterior or the encoder distribution here needs to look somewhat like a specified prior. Okay, that's sort of the two things. You can think of that as a regularizer. But that's interesting, right? Because once this model has been learned, I can do a couple of things. First of all, I can stick a datum in here into the learned model, evaluate elbow for that, right? And then compare that with all the other elbow values that I had during training and do a statistical test that says, hey, that is kind of in distribution or not, right? Interesting. Keep that in mind. The other thing is I actually have this prior, which pertains to this latent space. Within latent space, by that I mean the yellow thing here, which means I can literally walk around latent space and I can say, well, how likely is where I am right now given my prior, which also relates to the data distribution. Okay, so those two mechanisms are going to become interesting in a little while. So here's what's to come. First, I'm going to talk about imposing some structure in the latent space, where we talk about object-centric models and sort of causal transition a little bit. And then we're going to talk about exploiting some structure, okay? Where in terms of capability, I still think it's a little bit mind-bending, but that's cool. Okay, we'll get there. And there we'll talk about affordance learning and sort of trajectory planning. Okay, but let's get started with the imposed structure part first. So has anybody here worked on video prediction? Yeah, a little bit? Okay. Did you find that after a few frames, everything sort of dissolves? Yeah. The reason why that happens is because working on pixels is nuts, right? It is just, it is nuts because there are many, many, many of them, right? What you want is the underlying structure that explains how those pixels were formed in the first place, okay? And one way of thinking about that, of course, is that we want to reason about objects, okay? So we must do better than pixels in doing that. Explaining the world in that way actually massively reduces the possible space of images that you might see. Okay, and that again is helpful when it comes to predicting what might happen next, or even interpreting observations and so on. The other thing that's interesting when we deal with objects is we can start reasoning about interactions, right? Again, we can bring physicality into it, or behavior, for example, right? For example, if you have two cars on a motorway or cars on a motorway, it turns out then if the first one slows down, the second one hopefully also slows down, okay? So we can start reasoning about these sort of things. And object-centric models, whether generative or not, are sort of a viable, if they're generative, unsupervised way of starting to learn such structure, okay? And I'll talk about what Apex is in just a second. And that whole sort of field started, and I have to apologize. This is like an old slide. There are a bunch of dots here. If you worked in that area and you're not on the slide, apologies, I need to update it. But that's the whole point of this is to give you a sense of what happened in the past sort of couple of years there, right? In the sense that, it started fairly slow with some very, very nice work from Ali Islami et al. And then it started to get, slightly more busy around this object-centric sort of notion. And without sort of talking about all of that in detail, there's some typical design decisions that we think about here when we go object-centric. The first one is, do we go generative or not? Okay. Then we think about, is there structure in the latent factorization? So do we want to impose on the latent space, for example, a factorization such that part of it is where, part of it is what, part of it is this thing is present or otherwise. Okay. And there are reasons for and against. So it can be useful for downstream tasks. We'll see that. It can be detrimental for inference. As far as I'm concerned, the jury is still out on that. But some people make that case. Then, do we want segmentation versus bounding boxes? Right. Some can be more expensive than others. Fine. Do we want parallel versus sequential attending to objects? Generally speaking, parallel is good because if you do it sequentially, you're actually imposing an ordering. And that ordering is sort of unnatural, right? It's not there per se. And that can make the learning sort of more tricky. Then do you deal with individual scenes or do you deal with video information? Do you work in 2D or in 3D, okay? And so we're happy, I'm now delighted that together with my students, we have managed to make some contributions to that space, which is nice. And about a couple of those, I just want to tell you a little bit, just so you get a sense of what it actually means to build an object-centric model, okay? Okay, so an object-centric generative model, in this case, is just a latent variable model, right? If you're familiar with expectation maximization, you'll be familiar with this notion of the complete data, right? Where you have the data that you see, and then you assume some latent data that kind of completes the whole thing, that explains parts of the individual. So you have your data distribution, you assume a latent variable explanation for it, so your complete data. Then you take your latent variables, the z's, and you group them into describing a bunch of different objects and background. And that's literally looking at the vector and saying, actually, these guys, every 10 variables belong to an object, something like that, right? And then you can impose some additional structure here if you want in terms of what that is. Oops. And then typically you assume that these object latents are independent within a frame, okay? Which is a very standard naive Bayes assumption. And in a way, you already caught most of it. Apart from the fact that if you do that, of course, you fail to model object interactions. Okay, because if the objects are independent, they can't interact with one another, right? So that is one of the things that we sort of hooked into. And a few years ago, we came up with this model called Genesis, which literally had as its purpose to hook back into that distribution over the latents and say, well, actually, we're going to introduce an autoregressive prior. That means there is an object interaction. Another way you might want to do that with today is, for example, graph neural network. Okay. If you want to learn the dynamics. And that's nice because it's capable of inferring sort of scene components from an image, yes, but generating coherent novel scenes. So for example, I'll show you that in a second compared to a baseline. But this is the kind of thing that you would want to look at if you, for example, look at scene inference, right? So you've got some original scene, and you want to be able to split, and in this case it's actually reconstruction, but you want to be able to split this up into the individual components. And note that these are sort of super naughty simulated environments, okay? So let's just be clear about that. Yeah?
So actually, if you impose this regressive prior, so I have to know how you decide this prior. I mean, generally we decide prior as Gaussian distribution. That means if you want this prior autoregress operation, you must impose some, say, covariant match to a specific form. So how do you do that?
So you can actually learn it jointly with Elbow. So you can build that into the learning framework.
So You mean you made your prior learnable?
Yes. 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 And the details of that are in the paper. But actually, one of the payloads of this slide is the architecture diagram up there. Okay. So when you talk about, well, all nice to hear about the structuring, but what does that actually mean, right? How do I do that? Essentially, what it means is architecturally you assign meaning. Okay. So you have some input that comes in here. That thing gets encoded into a bunch of latent variables, and these are now grouped, right? These guys get decoded into essentially masks, right? Same size as image for a particular object. That thing, those masks, together with the original input, so now you're masking the thing that this thing is attending to, gets encoded into another latent vector that basically describes what this thing looks like, the what, okay? And then all of that gets decoded back into its own reconstruction of that particular object. Then all of that gets put together and superimposed. And if the overall thing looks like the scene that you care about, then basically you've won. Okay, that's the plan. That's, for example, in this case, how that is done. Okay, and so that just gives you a sense of. So when we did this, the only sort of prior work that we really could compare it to was Monet at the time. And so what you see here is it tends to be sort of physically plausible, sort of sharper reconstructions and so on. The detail of that isn't really that important. This is sort of give you a flavor of the variability, the variation. Or the sample diversity of it all, right? Which again is sort of just as a qualitative measure of how of what that does. Here, this is sort of the inference bit, right? So at the top, you see some input images, and what you then want to see is, so this is one model, this is Monet, this is Genesis. What you want to see is really tidy segmentations, which you don't necessarily get, so they get better here, which is nice, of course, and then those are the reconstructions you get from that. And then how that is split into the individual object slots. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Is it going in the right direction? Kind of. But I also talked about dealing with real data, right? And at that point, things become interesting. Because this is what happens when you take some really super simple real data, okay? So if you take something like Genesis or Monet or any of the earlier models on something like Sketchy or some of the Amazon Picking Challenge data, you take the original images up here, and what you get out in terms of segmentations is, pretty bad, both for Genesis and for Monet. Genesis may be a tad better, but it's a bit of a mess. And when it comes to generation, so these are samples. I don't know whether you can see them. They kind of look all over the place. So there are other things that we can do, and I'm not going to talk in detail through like what these other architectures look like. But Genesis v2 basically tried to improve on that. First of all, by looking by getting rid of this sort of sequential processing of the objects, so to avoid this unnatural ordering. So that we did that with a clustering effort, which is very similar to what Locardello did in slot attention, which is great. And it turns out that does significantly better when it comes to some of those challenges, right? So again, here we see the inputs, we see the segmentations, and we see the reconstructions, and up there, there's some samples, and there's some numbers that actually back up that they do particularly better. But when it comes to real-world data, we can already see that suddenly some sensible things happen, right? And we'll talk about an application of that in a second. But again, so we see the inputs here. These are the reconstructions. Think of this as a segmentation mask, okay? But those are the scene inferences, and I don't know whether you can see that, but even the samples kind of start to look reasonable. And similar sort of things happen when you talk about picking challenge data. The one thing that we still do here is massively over-segmented, okay? And that is something that we need to think about. The next thing then is stepping that up and going, well, what if we work with video input? Okay, and this is where we get back to this Apex model that I briefly showed you. Detail of that isn't necessarily that important, apart from the fact that it maintains this where, what, and present factorization of the latent space. But the interesting thing for that is that this now, so it takes video in and gives you a segmentation of the current scene in that structure, in that factorization, which means we can use it for one-shot object matching as well as tracking. Okay. And I don't know whether that matters right now, so it does really well, fine. But this is sort of interesting up here, right? Because if you think about what it means to have your latent space and to split it up into parts, for every object, you basically have a part of the latent that says this is where they are, like this is where the object is. You have a part that says this is what it looks like, and you also have a part that says does it exist or not in the first place, right? Then the bit that says this is what it looks like, you can use for matching. It's a bit like you've learned a fingerprint, right? You've learned a signature for a particular object, like an embedding that describes that object. And so that you can use for re-identifying an object. So you might, for example, have a template image like this one, you parse it, you get the individual objects out, and for each one you get a sense of where it is and what it looks like. You do the same thing with a live view, and then that fingerprint you can use to match that across, for example, to do a very simple rearrangement task. In this case, in simulation, but you get the gist of where that fits in. And I'll talk about an application of that in a second, but just to give you a flavor of what's to come. When you take that and you move it into 3D, you end up with a model that we published the first time, I think, middle of last year, something like that, where at this point every object is described by a nerve. And because we know about objects themselves, we can start doing, we can look at these scenes in 3D and different angles and so on, but we can start doing things like scene editing, right? So we can do things like add objects, remove them, generate the scenes, of course, but also scene manipulation, so we can move these things around. And at that point, things really start to become interesting on that front. But rather than just throw this stuff at you, let's talk about one of those cases where Ed and I kind of looked at each other and went, yeah, this is kind of similar to, in terms of outlook. Imagine that you have like a small batch manufacturing setup, right? So you have a company that doesn't make a billion of stuff, so they don't really want to have a massive layout in terms of robotics, right? But they make more than 5, so they need some form of automation. Ideally, you want then someone at the production line who can kind of take a robot, show the robot what's required today, and then the robot goes away and does that. That's sort of the setting that we're dealing with, right? And if you want that to happen in the entire workspace of the robot, you don't want to use something like RL because most of the time it's wasted, right? So RL typically has a very small workspace because it needs to do exploration. Do that throughout the entire workspace of a Panda and you'll be waiting most of your lifetime, okay? So there's some other things that we can do. And those of you who work with Ed will recognize this as very similar to Course to Find. There is a sort of a thread of works that is out there that literally looks at combining things like motion planning with things like RL, right? Motion planning where we know motion planning is required, and RL where we think RL is required, right? And so this is what happens here. So you might say, in order to get collision-free motion from anywhere in my workspace to my target, I can use motion planning. In order to perform contact-rich manipulation, I can do something like RL to learn a policy for that. But of course, I need to know where to go in the first place, and for that we use versatile sort of goal identification, okay? And perhaps what's next is sort of fairly obvious given the precursor of all of what I said before. But the idea then is to say, well, actually to get us close to a particular object or to a particular goal, we use motion planning once we know where that goal is. Say more about that in a second. Then we do a little bit of a hop. And the little bit of a hop we tend to think of as a skill transition network. So that is the bit that bridges between getting in the vicinity of the object and then getting into the region where the learned policy actually feels comfortable operating. Okay, that's what that does. And then we execute the actual insertion. Okay. And one of the bits, one of the places where the object-centric modeling that I mentioned fits in is, of course, with the object re-identification, right? So you have a demonstration, the arm ends up in the vicinity of a thing, and then the scene gets passed with something like Apex, in this case Apex. The right target object is identified from what is close to the arm, and then when you see a new scene, you basically do the same thing, you pass the scene, you re-identify the object, and you know where to go. And so this is essentially one shot, which is nice. And so the entire system works of something like 25 demonstrations. You can collect that within about 10 minutes, probably less. There is a phase where you do the sales training of the RL policy, which takes like about an hour, something like that. But it's not supervised. But yes, it is taped down. It's another conversation we had. It is stuck to the table. This is true. But nevertheless, it does that. But overall, it does end up working really quite robustly in that sort of context, which is nice. One caveat, and I'm aware I've thrown a whole bunch of models at you now. in the context of this conversation, I really just want you to know how that they exist, and I want you to know how we impose the structure, and then that they require this sort of reconstruction, okay? A reconstruction loss. And the reason why I want you to know that is because I want to put up a big old beware sign, because there's a problem that these models have, which is they rely on this reconstruction bottleneck, okay? So these guys rely on the fact that each one of these guys, together with each one of these guys, is just good enough to explain what we consider to be an object in each one of these slots, okay? If that is not given, I mean, if they're not good enough, then clearly nothing useful happens. But if it turns out that they are too high capacity, such that one of these slots can in the limit, explain the entire image, everything breaks, okay? Because we don't get that decomposition. And that's a problem. It's a problem because, first of all, it's intellectually annoying. Secondly, it means that there's a very tight coupling between the data set that you look at and the model, not the model architecture, but the model capacity that you specify, right? And so quite frequently recently, my students have come when we try to apply this stuff to different real-world scenarios and also different sort of toy data sets. And sometimes we really pare it back, and you'll see an example of that in a second. And we found that the data sets are actually too simple for those models to work, because they're too high capacity. And so at that point, we kind of do architecture search, so we literally narrow everything until we get back into the ballpark where this decomposition works. That is intensely annoying, but it's also a super interesting science opportunity. Okay, so I'll leave that out there, but that's sort of a thing to be aware of. Okay, I also mentioned I was going to talk about causal dynamics just very briefly, because there's some other stuff that I'd like to talk about. So far we talked about the object-centric representation, like scene inference and so on, but then there's the world model part, which is predicting how the world evolves, okay? And I don't know, is anybody here working with causality? Yeah, okay. Okay. I have to admit that I was a complete doubter when it comes to causality, okay? So one of the things that I like to do is I like to challenge myself and my students to say, convince me that actually where everybody says causality is a thing, convince me that it is actually true, okay? And I got some way towards that because Anson, who works on this, is pretty spectacular in what he does. So consider a sequence of observations and actions, okay? Causal discovery, much like symbolic logic, of course, requires meaningful causal variables, whatever meaningful means in this case, right? But so in order to do that, like if we want to do causal discovery, we want to know how things kind of hang together, we need some form of representation that is meaningful in that sense. And so the question is, how do we get that meaningful representation from observations? And if you've ever read anything about task-based learning, then you would have read something along the lines of, well, if we perform, I don't know, reaching, or if we perform manipulation, we will learn a representation that is useful for manipulation. And we've leveraged that lots of times in the past for navigation with radar and all that sort of stuff. But we're applying exactly the same thinking here. We're basically saying, imagine that you know an algorithm for causal discovery, right? And imagine you can sort of architecturally bake that into the structure. Then that becomes the task. The task is come up with a representation that is amenable for causal discovery and ultimately sort of causal reasoning. And that essentially is kind of what we're doing here. So learning the representation and the transition model jointly comes up with allows us to learn a representation that affords sort of causal discovery, and therefore is sort of semantically meaningful. And the second thing is that leveraging this causal structure also leads us to what we call a modular world model. And by that, specifically, I mean, when you transition to a different intervened world that you haven't seen before, I don't want to throw everything away and start again. I would like to only relearn the bits that have changed. And, okay, so this is not super important right now. So ultimately, you've got your observation model, as you would expect. You've got your transition model, fine. The policy you have, but we ignore them because right now we don't talk about policy learning as such. And again, so the environment we're exploring, this is super simple, where you've got sort of a different sort of particles. Some attract each other, some repel each other, some are constrained to particular axes in their motion, and so on. But the thing that actually makes this work is the fact that causality provides us some really useful inductive biases, 3 in particular. The first one is that causal mechanisms tend to be independent, right? So you might have a bunch, but they all explain different phenomena, so therefore they should be as independent as possible. Causal dependencies when it comes to individual elements of your latent space should be sparse. Good. And then sparse mechanism shift basically says if I have an intervened environment, only few things should change. Okay, that's basically it. And if you think about the factorization of the previous slide and the fact that you have a transition model, you can factor out the transition model into something fairly complex. Don't worry about it too much. But actually, when you dig into it, and I encourage you to look at the paper because Anson explains it beautifully well. When you dig into it, this is sort of, you can bake those three things into this loss, right? You have into this transition model. So you have your independent mechanisms by multiplying them up. Sparse causal dependencies by literally introducing masks, okay? And sparse interventions by basically saying we can model, we can learn which mechanisms seem to be intervened, okay? That's it. And when you do that, you end up with a representation that is able to learn what variables have been intervened on, right? So when you see a new environment, you can say, well, actually, it looks like this particular mechanism is different, okay? Which is super interesting, and you can do better predictions. But this is interesting, because what that means is that this is time horizon prediction, and after only 10 frames, so I'll give you 10 frames of training data in a new environment, that is enough to only relearn the bits that need to be relearned to make successful predictions. Okay, so that's that in a nutshell. Okay, I do want to talk about some exploitation, so I kind of skip about that rather glibly now. But let's briefly talk about this. Okay, so imagine that you have an experiment that you might have in psychology, which is like a reaching experiment, right? So you have a bunch of subjects, like children, for example, and the question is, you're allowed to, so you're supposed to reach something with a tool, okay? But you're not allowed to reach into the red arena, and this is the goal, the green thing, and you're not allowed to touch any of the blue stuff, okay? Those are the rules. Okay. Keep that experiment in mind, because now I want to talk to you about a very, very simple, but sort of somewhat mind-blowing because effective trick of doing disentanglement in a way, okay? So imagine that you have your VAE structure or your learned representation, this yellow thing, and you have a constraint predictor, which I want you to think of as a classifier, okay? That classifier might just be saying, yes, I've reached my goal, or no, in fact, it might just be saying, yes, that tool is good enough to reach the goal in this particular constraint environment, okay? That's all that thing does. It's a binary label, okay? You guys happy with activation maximization? Yeah? Okay, so imagine, so typically if I run this forward, so this guy is a classifier that operates on the latent space, okay? So I have a latent space input, I put that into the classifier, and there might be something else that represents the environment, okay? And this guy says, oh, no, can't do that at all, okay? But now I'm going to pin that and say, you know what, okay, you say that you can't do that at all. I want you to make the output positive, right? I'm saying, make this positive, and I'm going to back-propagate the errors back into the latent space, which basically means I will start walking around the latent space. It's like gradient descent, okay? But the beauty of that is I can do that with absolutely anything that I can express as a classifier, for example, which tends to be quite a lot of stuff, including quite a lot of complex stuff, okay? And so what we then do is we say, okay, well, in the beginning, you might have a tool that isn't good enough, but then we backprop into the latent space, and as we walk around the latent space, we can decode, right, which gives rise to another tool, and we see the tool change, okay? And before I show you what happens next, this is actually super interesting. We found it in lots of different places, useful in lots of different places, to specify complex or high-level semantic and often non-differentiable constraints, right? And it provides this entanglement of specific factors of variation without having to insist on this axis alignment that you typically say, ooh, you know, length must be in this one particular dimension and so on, okay? And that is sort of a really interesting concept. But let me show you what happens. So this is the training data. These are the scenarios. We have a tool image and tool silhouette because we do it in 3D. And we have a whole bunch of those that are automatically generated. And for each one, we provide a feasibility label. That's a binary label that says goes or doesn't go. Okay. And this you've already seen. We kind of learn a related representation, an embedding for the tool. We have an embedding for the environment. And we use backpropagation with a predictor that just says yes, works or doesn't work. And here's what happens. So as we walk around that latent space and decode back, we see things varying, okay? And there are a couple of things while, even after a whole bunch of years now, I look at this and I'm still somewhat blown away. The first thing that we see from an affordance point of view is that what emerges here are things like length, width, shape that we never really told the system about. Okay, so that's interesting. The second thing that we notice is this stuff is varying smoothly, which is mind-blowing, right? Because there's no reason why that should, and we're still chasing why that actually happens. Okay, and we've seen it over and over again, which is sort of important. Some numbers that say we win, fine, but from an affordance point of view, that means that these sort of affordances emerge as trajectories in that latent space, just driven by this high-level semantic description of a task. Okay, and that is sort of a really, really sort of interesting trick that we stumbled across that has driven quite a lot of stuff for us. And if you look at that, another way of interpreting that might be to say, well, actually, it looks a bit like path planning, right? Eventually, you're planning a path to a goal, which also occurred to us, and then we thought, well, actually, if that's like path planning, can we use this to plan, right? And so we came up with another sort of fairly harebrained experiment at the beginning, which looked a bit like this. We said, okay, take all the joint angles and the Cartesian end effector positions of a robot arm, right? Encode that, and so you can do that with motor bubbles. So only show this thing feasible trajectories. Feasible, not even trajectories, just feasible positions, configurations, okay? Encode that, decode that, learn this VAE model, and then have a classifier that says, am I currently in collision with something? And the answer is that really works, which is somewhat mind-blowing, right? So you end up with trajectories that take you around obstacles towards particular goals. Now, it didn't quite work out of the box, because if I just put it in the box as is, what I would end up with a good chunk of the times is this, right? You would end up in places where you're stuck, right? Because you get singularities and so on, fine. But don't forget that we are using a generative model, okay? So now we go back to the point where we're saying, well, actually, as I walk around latent space, I could add another constraint, not just don't collide with stuff, right? But I could add another constraint that says, stay in an area of latent space where you're happy, right? Which is highly likely under the prior of the data that you've learned, keeping in mind that the data that we've learned on were feasible positions, okay? And so what you get is a constraint that actually takes you through those singularities, okay? Now, the interesting thing about that, so it comes with no performance guarantees, and if you're really into wanting to make arms do stuff, you go, okay, I'm probably not going to use that. But then you hear that actually this stuff is about an order of magnitude faster than traditional planning methods, right? But it doesn't come with any sort of performance guarantees. Now, in this case also, you might say, well, actually that isn't particularly useful because it requires some form of state space description of the environment, like these obstacles, right? And we also got somewhat annoyed by that, and sort of it's not straightforward, but it's a natural way of thinking about that. This is exactly the same system where the individual, where the collision classifier is swapped out with essentially a variant of scene collision net, which takes a point cloud and the robot configuration and says, am I in collision? Which is exactly what we want. Okay, so that sort of drives this backward from here, and it turns out that with that we can do some fairly interesting stuff. It's not perfect. One of the challenges that we have with that is path length. So at times the robot basically, might go over the obstacle and then sort of do this for a bit and then go back, right? And that is something that we're working on. But in terms of a method, given that it's exactly the same thing that did the affordance learning, it's pretty surprising that works. Okay. And I'm going to tell you, even though that wasn't the case, that now we thought about how far we can push this. Actually, we did it the other way around. We started with the quadruped before we did the arm. But the question then was, well, how far can we push this? Because here's an interesting thing. What we're doing there is jointly modeling all the joints, all the degrees of freedom in the entire system. There's nothing hierarchical going on here at all, right? Whereas typically, with a system like this, and I'm not a quadruped guy, I hasten to add, but my colleagues tell me, in a system like this, you would have some form of hierarchical planner, hierarchical controller that says, well, actually, I want the base to be here, therefore the legs need to do this, and so each individual leg needs to do the following thing, right? And you sort of have a hierarchy of systems like that. We are going to do something different. We're going to do exactly the same thing that you already know, and we're going to throw all of that into one melting pot and we're going to model, essentially, the statistics. We're building a statistical model of this system, okay? And of course, if you ever work with quadrupeds, there's a whole bunch of constraints, of challenges that we have, like kinematic constraints, dynamic constraints, all of that stuff, nonlinear, yada yada. Not really that important right now. But unsurprisingly, we're going to do what we did before, which is we're going to replace the kinematic constraints and the dynamic constraints by learning a generative model, and these guys we're going to frame as predictors, classifiers. Okay. And there are some reasons why this is super useful and interesting, but let me show you what the results are. So here we're going to, as an input, we're basically going to use state variables, joint angles, joint torques, feet positions, and so on. And we're going to have, to begin with, a classifier that says, is this thing stable or not? To begin with, we're doing this in simulation. So here we're saying, okay, I'll put this stance in, I want it to be stable. Tell me what happens, and the quadruped sort of moves its feet under it, which was our first sign that we might be onto something interesting. Then we said, okay, if we want to get a quadruped to walk, a walk consists of different stances. It's basically you're passing through a breadcrumb trail of stances. And at this point, we cheat. Have we cheated yet? No, actually. Okay, this is not super important. Actually, the only payload of the slide is everything that I show you is dynamically feasible and kinematically feasible, and with like super smooth and not very jerky motions, which again is super surprising because it speaks to the smoothness of the latent space. Not really that important right now. Okay, so at this point we cheat because we're saying, well, actually we can encode a gait, a walk, by going through a sequence of stances. We can gray code the labels for that, the classifier labels, to structure the latent space, and so this is induced by us. I'll show you how to get rid of that in a second. Okay, but then basically what we have is a breadcrumb, is like a carrot that says, okay, the classifier says, are you in this stance yet? Yes. Are you in this stance yet? No, get to that stance, and so on. So you have a carrot that sort of takes you around the latent space, and what you end up with is an actual physical, real-world walking quadruped, which is mind-blowing given that all we trained this thing with is individual stances, not even trajectories, stances of feasible joint configurations. That's it. Okay? But that begs the question, what we can do with that latent space without inducing that structure. And the answer, of course, is we would expect that to emerge when we have trajectories. Okay? So we deal with trajectories. We input trajectories, we predict trajectories. And this is truly mind-blowing for the following reason. So what you get is structure, as you would expect, which is nice. That's cool. But the other thing that you get, because the disentanglement, is you get a single control signal that controls the entire thing. Okay, and that control signal. So this is what you see when you. So this, by the way, is sort of a 2D projection of the neural activation map, right? That you see, and eventually you'll see these sort of cycles, which you might think of limit cycles, and they are induced by this sort of signal. And this signal has some characteristics that we can continuously vary, and they now directly correspond to traits of the gait. So, for example, we can make sure that we step faster, or we can effect that we put the feet up higher, or we can, of course, change direction, and so on. And at that point, that's sort of novel, right? Because the continuous variation of those gaits traits while the robot is operating is not something that people really did or used to know how to do. And that is pretty cool, particularly given that this is ×1, so that that works. But of course, we're using a generative model, okay? Which means that exactly the same way as we did before, we can detect when we are out of distribution, meaning when the robot gets pushed and it goes, this is nothing like I saw during training, we can then enforce that something happens, okay? And in this case, it turns out there's some studies out there that say if I pushed you right now, you would start stepping faster, right? So all we do here is get the robot to step faster. And that significantly widens the stability basin of this platform. Right. So what you see here, from a quadruped sort of world, might be a little bit like, kick big dog 8 years ago, right? Yes. But the way that this was learned is fundamentally different in terms of how that works. This was literally done just by observing very, very narrow gate parameters. Okay. One thing that I just want to throw out there because it's sort of interesting and not implying any sort of causation here at all. Is, it easily transfers to different platforms, etc., etc. But what I've shown you is sort of these sort of cycles in the neural population projection, right? And that means that we can control this stuff with sort of these signals. And one of my postdocs, outgoing, sadly, who's also a computational neuroscientist, looked at that and said, I've seen this before somewhere. And it turns out he did. He saw it in a Nature publication a bunch of years ago, right, where somebody looked at walking gaits in primates and reaching tasks in primates and mapped the neural population and projected it down to 2D and found these limit cycles. Okay, so this is the original figure. And we looked at that and we thought, this is intriguing. Okay, and we didn't really get much further than, wow, this is intriguing. Other than, if you ever heard of a central pattern generator, which is this thing that sort of tries to get you coordinate your body. There are some people who try to get robots to operate like that, where we're saying, actually, we assume the central pattern generator exists, and we're trying to get robots to do a thing. And so they enforced that into the architecture. We didn't do that. We actually found that sort of thing happen, which for us is a fairly intriguing thing. If you like any of that research, as part of a program grant that we're running from Sense into Collaboration, which is literally about embodied intelligence and the building blocks thereof, we're doing the full gamut of sensing, perceiving, navigating, coordinating, effective computing, metacognition, which I would love to talk about but don't really have the time. But very happy to talk to you about any of that stuff. And because there's a benchmark, we are also thinking about launching a benchmark, which is actually about an open-ended assembly one. So if you're interested in getting into doing this with a single hand or bimanually, which is where we're headed with this, and you want something that's inspired by an actual manufacturing problem where you want to assemble prefab things, then this might be of interest to you. Okay. And I have to say thank you to all of my students. This is a somewhat dated photo right now, but it's a bunch of years of work that I've talked about. But without them, of course, it wouldn't have happened. And that is it. Thank you very much.